Following Operation Iraqi Freedom, the United States worked to reestablish civil institutions and rebuild the military and police forces in Iraq. Nonetheless, conditions in the country deteriorated, leaving a security void that ISIL managed to exploit. We owe it to our men and women in uniform to learn lessons from that experience so that history does not repeat itself. It is critical that we do all we can here in Congress to ensure a stable Iraq after ISIL is defeated. Today's hearing will offer members an opportunity to learn more about how the administration intends to achieve success beyond the battlefield. Our first panel of very insightful outside experts will discuss the broader strategic issues associated with ISIL's loss of territory and highlight critical issues that should be considered as the administration's Iraq policy evolves. Our second panel today will address the numerous challenges associated with stabilization and rebuilding in Iraq and discuss the status of U.S. government efforts to improve the political and security environment in Iraq. I now turn to my colleague, Ranking Member Moulton, for his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I want to echo her comments on how fortunate we feel to have such a talented and distinguished panel here to help us understand these problems. Today, the subcommittee will focus on the critically important task of securing the peace in Iraq after the defeat of ISIS. I echo Chairwoman Hartzler's frustration in securing appropriate administration witnesses to answer the full gamut of questions the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee is within its purview to raise, but I'm grateful for everyone's presence here today and ongoing service to our country. I also appreciate our outside witnesses who will bring considerable depth of expertise to bear on this subject, including Ambassador Crocker, whom I first met in Iraq while serving under General Petraeus. I think that's where I met you as well, Ken. As we convene here today, Iraqi security forces, supported by the U.S. Advise and Assist mission, have succeeded in retaking most major population centers once controlled by ISIS: Fallujah, Ramadi, and Mosul, ISIS's power center in Iraq. Most recently, coalition-supported Iraqi forces seized back the city of Tal Afar in the northwestern corner of Iraq, and only isolated ISIS strongholds remain outside of Hawija, Qaim, and other pockets along the Syria-Iraq border. Such victories have not been without a human toll. ISIS's brutal tactics, employing civilians as human shields, vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, and booby-trapped residential areas resulted in over 1,400 Iraqi troops killed and at least 7,000 wounded, according to our embassy in Baghdad. During the campaign, 2 American service members were killed and over 20 were wounded. The U.S. commander of the Combined Joint Task Force in charge of the counter-ISIS campaign, Lieutenant General Stephen Townsend, called it the, quote, worst fighting he had seen in 35 years, end quote, of combat experience, and likened it to Fallujah 2004 on steroids. Civilian losses have been greater still, with the latest UN estimates at 8,000 killed and 1.2 million rendered homeless, displaced by the fighting. Despite the tragic human toll, I am encouraged by the progress we have made in partnership with Iraqi forces to defeat the scourge of ISIS, and look forward to hearing from our witnesses an update on the final stages of the military campaign. As important and necessary as these operations are to militarily defeat ISIS, I remain concerned that without sufficient post-conflict planning and resourcing, we will find ourselves and Iraqi forces condemned to refighting the same battles so many have already given their lives for in the past. At its core, what troubles Iraq are fundamentally political questions. Just as I disagreed with the Obama administration, I am again concerned that this new administration is not sufficiently prioritizing such underlying political dynamics. What does this mean? First and foremost, I am concerned Iraqi security forces may be woefully unprepared to provide security to Iraqi civilians and ensure displaced persons can return to their homes without fear of attack or retribution. Experts I have heard from here in Washington and in Iraq have expressed worries of insufficient hold forces and police, compounded by the beleaguered state of Iraqi military units, reeling from the toll of the brutal counter-ISIS campaign. Without sufficient local security arrangements, we cannot expect for Iraq to be stabilized, for civilians to return to normalcy, and for communities to be defended against the emergence of a, quote, ISIS 2.0 or other militant groups. Moreover, without capable and professional security forces, we risk seeing a repeat of the same sectarian tensions leading to Sunni embitterment that provided fertile ground for the growth of ISIS in the first place. Beyond the provisioning of civilian security, key gaps and problems remain to be addressed, such as acute food insecurity, insufficient access to health care, destroyed infrastructure, degraded public services and utility, newly inflamed grievances among local communities, and insufficient plans for governance arrangements in many areas. Both as a Marine infantry officer who worked side by side with Iraqis to turn the tide of the insurgency, and now as a congressman and ranking member of this Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, I look forward to your testimony and hope to hear a proactive, whole-of-government strategy that represents the only chance of success. I cannot tell you how painful it is, as an Iraq War veteran, to see us fighting and refighting the same battles we fought and for which so many of our friends gave their lives. At this rate, my children will be fighting these same battles. We must hear from this administration how this time will be different, how this time you will ensure a political resolution so that the U.S. military doesn't have to keep coming back and cleaning up the mess every time Iraqi politics falls apart. Thank you, Chairwoman Hartzler, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moulton. So I'm pleased to recognize our witnesses we have for our first panel. They are very distinguished, and we appreciate their time. We're joined by the Honorable Ryan Crocker, former ambassador to Iraq and currently serving as diplomat in residence in the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. We have Dr. Kenneth Pollack, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and Dr. Mark Lynch, professor of political science at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. So, welcome. Ambassador Crocker, we'll start with your statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Moulton, members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to be here today. I must say it's a lot more fun being on the outside panel than on the panel that will follow us. I think you both have hit on the essential fact here. The Islamic State is, in essence, not a military problem. Its existence is a symptom of a much deeper problem. I went through a couple of years in Iraq, 07 to 09, the time of the surge. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the forerunner of Islamic State, was a key target of ours and the Iraqis. But even at the height of the surge, we could never absolutely eliminate them. Badly weakened, but still there. Parts and pockets of Mosul and a fluid presence up the Euphrates River Valley. Why? Because, again, with all that the surge achieved politically, as well as militarily, we saw a period there when the Iraqi Arab Sunnis came back into government, when Prime Minister Maliki took on the Sadrist forces in Basra, throughout the south, and in Baghdad itself. But there still lingered an abiding mistrust on the part of some communities, the Sunni Arabs in particular, of what would happen next. And that gave Al-Qaeda in Iraq space enough to survive. So here we are on the brink of a decisive military difficulty, or a victory. But what we have to be able to do is win the peace. Madam Chairwoman, that is not going to happen unless this administration decides that Iraq is a national security priority. Sadly, if there is a chance to get this right, it will be in Iraq. Syria has, I'm afraid, quite a ways to burn before you can talk about an effective political process there. And that's going to take a lot of sustained effort. It will require a Secretary of State who is willing to go to Baghdad, spend time there, get to know the politicians, get a feel for what's possible and what isn't, and in so doing, have the full backing of the President. If we do less than that, I fear that we will see another slide downhill. We can look at Iraq itself, or we can look at another example, say Afghanistan after the defeat of the Soviets. We decided our work then was done. We pulled out. On the way out, we sanctioned Pakistan, who had been our most allied of allies, and that act, incidentally, reverberates today. Why the Pakistanis hedge their bets? They think we're going to pull out again. And I do commend the administration for making it quite clear that we are not talking about calendars anymore. We're talking about conditions. So it's going to take a formidable political effort to bring things to a better place in Iraq. Madam Chairwoman, we're hardwired into their political system. I found during my time there that we could be the catalyst that made good things happen, but we would have to get something from one party, conditionally, take that to the other party, and we found that when we did that, some of the time, they would give things to us to work that they couldn't do directly with each other. Madam Chairwoman, I understand that people in this country are tired of the never-ending wars in Iraq, now in Syria, that the Hill is tired of this conflict. I get it about being tired. I spent 7 years of my life post 9/11 in Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan, so I know about tired. But there are worse things. When we decided that we would not intervene or continue our presence in Afghanistan, the totally predictable civil war broke out between rival Afghan factions, culminating in the victory of the Taliban, and that was the road to 9/11. Policies have consequences. The absence of policies have consequences. So again, I commend you, Madam Chairwoman and the Ranking Member, for bringing us together at this time to concentrate on how we might get it right. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Pollock.
Apologies. Like my predecessor, Ambassador Crocker, and as you all pointed out in your opening statements, I too am very concerned about the political repercussions of the future of Iraq and American policy there. I guess I'm heartened that we Americans now duly intone that victory in Iraq or any of the Middle Eastern wars will not be won by military forces alone. But I am nevertheless disappointed and frustrated that we rarely ever walk the walk, even though we've learned to talk the talk. The one time when we actually got it right was, of course, when Congressman Moulton and Ambassador Crocker were in Iraq. And I do not see the willingness or the level of preparations on the part of this administration that we saw at that time. I'd like to use my opening statement to just lay the groundwork for what I envision as being necessary for a post-Daesh American commitment to Iraq. And I'm going to be very brief to just sketch out the broad framework. But I think it is important to start talking through the details of what is going to be necessary because, again, as Ambassador Crocker knows better than any of us, in Iraq in particular, the devil is in the details. To talk about things just kind of in a broad, airy-fairy way and simply say that we need to be there is not going to be helpful. We need to talk about what it means to be there. We need to talk about what engagement looks like, and in particular, and again, as both you, Madam Chairwoman, and Congressman Moulton and Ambassador Crocker have all emphasized, we need to be focused on Iraq's politics and how the United States can help move Iraq's politics forward. Now, all that said, it does start with the military side. Yes, we have won an important victory over Daesh. That is a useful step forward. But we all know that Iraq's security is not going to simply be perfect moving forward. It is going to require residual efforts. and in particular, it is going to require a residual American force in the country. That force's mission will be primarily political. Yes, there are military things that it can and should do, but we need to focus on its political role as being the most important of all. In that, it needs to be able to reassure Iraqis that force will not be used against them, including by their own government or by quasi-governmental entities. That force needs to be able to prevent the repoliticization of the Iraqi military, and it needs to maintain the combat and logistical capabilities of the Iraqi military that we have so painstakingly built and then abandoned and rebuilt repeatedly, but that is critical to allowing the Iraqi government to maintain a monopoly on the use of violence. All of that is going to require a stay-behind American force, and I would argue that it needs to be bigger rather than smaller to serve these political purposes. If you said to me we would put 25,000 or keep 25,000 troops in Iraq, I would throw a party. I imagine that that might be a bridge too far politically, but I think that 10,000 would be perfectly adequate. But we need to be thinking fairly large for these political reasons. Shifting quickly over to the political and economic dimensions, which are, as we've all agreed, far more important, we need to recognize that we have a moment now. Iraqis are gleeful that they have defeated ISIS. They are desirous of a better future. They want their government to work better, and they are hopeful that they will get it. But they have been frustrated so many times in the past, we shouldn't assume that they are going to remain patient for all that long. And the problem is, when they grow frustrated, they begin taking unilateral actions that lead them back down the path of civil war. We need to help the Iraqi government to start to deliver right now, soon, in particular before their elections. We can't rebuild the country completely. We cannot even help the Iraqis do so. We can't turn it into Switzerland. What we can do is to start programs that are going to give the Iraqis a sense of progress moving forward, a sense that their government can deliver, a sense that the United States is committed to them and their government, and the hope for a better future. If we can do that, and I've outlined a number of specific projects in my written testimony, if we can do that moving forward, we will keep the Iraqis committed to this political process. That's what we have to have. That's what we need for Iraq to succeed over the long term, that kind of a start. If we don't, we are likely to be repeating our mistakes all over again.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lynch.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Moulton. It's a real honor to be here on a panel with Ambassador Crocker and Ken Pollack, and it's quite an experience to be sitting here in 2017 and largely agree with each other on the major issues, which would not have happened in 2007. And that, I think, is grounds for hope, that there actually is, I think, a bipartisan sense now of the urgency of having a sustained commitment to getting Iraq right. And I think that's something to build upon. What's more, as we've heard, I think there's also almost a unanimous consensus among analysts across all stripes that if we hope to actually contain, defeat, and degrade and defeat ISIS, we're going to need some kind of sustained political economic reconstruction strategy. And the idea of the primacy of the political is something which I think was not present before. And again, this is grounds for hope. I think we agree on the diagnosis in ways which I think was not true before. So in my written testimony, I offer, I think, some fairly detailed discussion of a number of issues. I just want to highlight several which I think would be useful for us to think about now and hopefully have time to discuss. The first is, as Ken said, that there is a window of opportunity now, but it won't last for long. I think that we recently published in the page I edit for the Washington Post, we published a piece by an Iraqi pollster who found really quite remarkable findings. Found 51% of Sunnis now saying that the country is going in the right direction, 71% of Sunnis saying that they had favorable views of Prime Minister Abadi. In 2014, the same pollster found 5% of Sunnis said the same about Prime Minister Maliki. This is directly and clearly tied to the national campaign to defeat ISIS and liberate those areas. But it also is fleeting, because the conditions under which these people who've been liberated, the conditions they're living in are terrible. They're being sustained by a massive international humanitarian effort, which has been supported and coordinated extremely well by the coalition. But in a sense, it is standing in for the Iraqi state and providing the necessary means of survival for the millions of people who've been liberated from ISIS. This is a testament to a successful coordination of an unprecedented humanitarian response, but it's also dangerous because when the next humanitarian crisis emerges and the international NGOs move on, who is going to be taking care of all of these people who are not currently being tied to the Iraqi state? And so one of the most important things I think we need to have on the agenda is a sustained transition strategy moving from disaster relief and crisis relief to a sustainable strategy for providing services, goods, and critically governance for the people in these liberated areas. I know planning of that kind is going on now. It's extremely important that it be fully funded and made equal and parallel to the military track. I think that we all probably have thoughts on the impact of the Kurdish referendum and the crisis that I think it has sparked. I think at this point, all we need to say is that it's urgently necessary that we take whatever efforts needed to calm things down and to try and stop the politicians on all sides, both inside the country and outside the country, from taking escalatory steps. So we have to keep the dialogue going, and I think this is pretty important for maintaining the campaign against ISIS. I think that for all of the military issues, I think that I would come back again and again to the fundamental problem, which is a crisis of state capacity in Iraq. We have consistently seen the inability to construct state institutions which are accountable, effective, authoritative, and honest. And I think this is at the root of Sunni alienation. This is at the root of the inability of the government of Iraq to provide vital services, electricity, health, everything that you might think of, not necessarily in the capital, but in the rural areas, in the Sunni areas, the places where you are likely to see a reimagined ISIS insurgency take root. And so I think that it's easy to say that we need a whole-of-government approach and we need to have the politics and the economics along with the military, but I would actually hope that we take seriously as a government the actual primacy of these issues. If we do not find ways to actually have the Iraqi government, with our assistance, provide sustainable and meaningful quality of life, accountable, transparent, and honest governance to the people across the core constituencies of the regime, then we are going to see almost inevitably major problems to come. The other point that I'd like to make, which I think is the one area where we might have some disagreements on the panel, is that, of course, what happens in Iraq is unfolding in the midst of ongoing political tension and competition with Iran. And there are major issues in how we should be thinking about our relationship with Iran, the nuclear deal, the spread of Shiite militias. These are important and vital issues. But I would simply put out there for discussion that Iraq is the single worst place where we could attempt to push back on Iranian influence in the region, and that we should prioritize the stabilization of Iraq and trying to maintain the fragile Iraqi political consensus first, and find other arenas where we might try and push back or contain Iranian influence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lynch. And you hit on there your last comment, the point that I was going to start off with my questioning, and that was dealing with Iran. It's been interesting to watch their burgeoning role there in this recent conflict, and them taking so much control of various militias and assisting, quote unquote. But Ambassador Crocker, I thought you had some interesting comments in your testimony that says some in the country believe that cooperation with Iran in confronting ISIL is possible and desirable. You said it is neither. Iran does not feel threatened by ISIL. And then you go on that these units are potentially a greater threat to Iraqi stability and our interests than ISIL was. That really, this paragraph jumped out at me. So I would like to hear from you your thoughts on the threat potentially of Iran and the advances that they have made in the country of Iraq, and then how you think we ought to deal with that. And then I'll probably turn to the other witnesses too to kind of get a overview of this situation, because as you said, Dr. Lynch, this is a very important issue we have to deal with.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It is indeed a critical issue. What we find today is that Iranian influence in Iraq is at an all-time high. both directly and indirectly through the so-called popular mobilization units that are far more under the control of Tehran than they are of Baghdad. It is important, I think, to take a step back and ask why. Why are the Iranians doing this? Biography and history are important. Qasem Soleimani, the leader of Iran's Quds Force, their external operations element, commissioned in the Iranian army a couple of months before Iraq invaded Iran. He served through 8 years of that horrific war. It'd be like a British subaltern going through the Western Front, not for 4 years, but for 8. So what do people like Qasem Soleimani think about when they think about Iraq? Never again. Never again will there be an Iraq that could present an existential threat to the Iranian nation. So their interest is not stability in Iraq. It's the opposite. To maintain a maximum level of influence, but also to ensure that the Iraqi government can never quite get its balance. And they're doing a pretty good job of it. So while I certainly don't urge a military confrontation with Iran in Iraq, I do think we need to be clear-eyed about this. Their objectives in no way harmonized with ours. And we're going to have to figure out how we can ramp up and give the Iraqi government and people some choices over influence that they currently don't have, because with our absence, the Iranian presence is really the only game in town.
Good, thank you. Dr. Pollack, do you have some thoughts on that?
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. I feel like I may be somewhere in between my two panelists, both on this issue as well as physically. I start by agreeing with Ambassador Crocker that Iran's interests are ultimately not our interest in Iraq, that Iran's influence there has grown disproportionately, and that ultimately it should be a goal of American policy to limit Iran's influence in Iraq, recognizing that it will never be zero because of their proximity to one another. That said, I also felt very strongly about some of Mark Lynch's comments. I think that Dr. Lynch is absolutely correct that we're in a precarious moment, and I don't think that Ambassador Crocker was saying otherwise, right? This is part of the trick moving forward in Iraq, which is right now Iran does have enormous influence in Iraq. Right now, a great many Iraqi politicians are very frightened of the Iranians, and it's going to take them a lot to get them to the point where they trust us enough to simply give the stiff arm to the Iranians. I also agree that while I'm a strong proponent of pushing back on the Iranians across the region, in fact, I am testifying tomorrow before the House Foreign Affairs Committee on exactly that topic, I agree with the statement that Dr. Lynch made that Iraq is not the place for that, right? There are a lot of things that we need to do in Iraq. They are important to us on their own terms. Iraq is not the right arena for competition with Iran because of Iran's greater influence there and the fragility of the Iraqi system. I will simply say that I think that where we ought to focus our efforts, and again, I think this is very much consonant both with Ambassador Crocker's remarks and with his own experience, is on building up the Iraqi government and helping the Iraqis to re-achieve their own unity, certainly among Arab, Sunni, and Shia. You know, the moment where we had the greatest success against Iran in Iraq after the 2003 invasion was in the spring of 2008, when the Iraqi government, then led by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, sent mostly Sunni brigades down to Basra to drive the Shia Jaish al-Mahdi, backed by Iran, out of the Shia city of Basra. And what was so amazing to me, and I was in Basra right after the operation, was how the Shia welcomed these mostly Sunni troops, because they saw them as simply Iraqis who were here to drive out the foreigners, the Persians. If we can get the Iraqis back to that point where they once again feel like Iraqis and not just Sunni and Shia, they will do a far more effective job than we can in driving the Iranians out. The trick is, exactly as Ambassador Crocker pointed out, to be able to do that and to do it at a moment when the Iranians are very influential in Iraq and watching to see what our next move is.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lynch.
Great, thank you. And I think I'm not as far away from Ken on the analysis as I am physically, so that's good. So I think that you have to begin from the recognition that, as Ambassador Crocker said, Iran's role in Iraq is not going to disappear for reasons of geography, of sectarian affiliation, of deep economic investment, widespread personal relationships, and their cultivation of a portfolio of political allies and proxies, not only the Shiite side, but across the entire spectrum. Iran, I think, has done a very good job of embedding itself deeply in the texture and the fabric of Iraqi politics. But this is not uncontroversial, and we actually are in a moment where there is increasing sign of resistance within unexpected communities to a dominant Iranian role. Not the existence of an Iranian role, but a dominant Iranian role. And here I think is where the place for the United States is less, in my opinion, about pushing back on Iran directly, as it is building up the Iraqi state and giving a professional bureaucracy, a professional military, which can become the foundation of the kind of national politics that Dr. Pollack was describing. And there I think there are real things that we can do which do not have to be cast in a confrontational way and don't hopefully have the risk of overturning this extremely delicate political moment. Of course, Ambassador Crocker is right about this, as he is about all things, in terms of the lack of strategic harmony between the United States and Iran in Iraq. But I would say that in the crisis moment of 2014, I think this was less the case. When it appeared that Baghdad was at the brink of falling and that there was a real perception that the whole thing could come falling apart, there was a convergence on the need to protect the Iraqi state, prevent the advance of ISIS, and work together in a pragmatic way. And this was something which was never going to last, but if you hadn't seen the HUSH, the Popular Mobilization Units going to the front at the time they did, we could be having a very different conversation right now about a shattered and lost Iraqi state. And that's an important thing to remember. Not all of the PMF units are the same. Some of them are, I would say, functionally the equivalent of the Sahwa, the Awakening brigades. Some of them are straight up Iranian proxy forces, and having a differentiated view of that is quite important. When you have Muqtada al-Sadr going to Saudi Arabia, when you have the appearance of outreach from key Shia constituencies out into the Sunni Arab world, these are important things which I think should be used diplomatically and not dismissed purely on sectarian grounds. And so I think that what we should be thinking about is creating a place for the United States to be the actor that is supporting governance in Iraq and providing services and supporting a project of state first, politics first, and rather than trying to compete with Iran on its own terms in those sorts of ways.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to turn to the ranking member now, but I will want to follow up at some point, if you don't address it, in the willingness of the Iranians to allow for a consolidated government to form with a significant amount of Sunni involvement in that, but we can come back later. Now turn to ranking member Moulton.
Thank you, Chairwoman Hartzler. And as someone who witnessed firsthand the influence of Iran in Iraqi politics and, frankly, in military affairs, I just want to emphasize my agreement with the importance of these questions. It's hard, I think, to see how, if Iran is fundamentally opposed to our interest in building an Iraqi state, we're going to make this work without confronting that threat as well. So thank you very much. Gentlemen, you I think all agreed, remarkably so, on the importance of the primacy, to use one of your words, of a political effort here and in building the Iraqi state. You've also, Ken, you talked about, Dr. Pollack, you talked about the value of 10,000 troops, maybe even 25,000 troops. We're going to ask the administration from their witnesses how they are prepared to execute such a political plan, or if they're prepared to do so at all. But could you talk for a minute, each of you, about why this is worth it? Why is it worth the United States investment to put in 10,000 troops even if their effort is mainly political? Why is it worth the investment of State Department resources and aid and development resources to build up the Iraqi state? We've been there a long time, and many Americans are asking, why don't we just pull out and go home? And Ambassador Crocker, you referred to this a little bit in your introduction, but just explain to the American people why this investment is worthwhile and why now is the right time to make it. Ambassador Crocker, you're welcome to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Moulton. What we are seeing in the region, potentially in Iraq, is not just the overthrow of regimes, but the collapse of states. And sadly, when states collapse, other forces will fill the void, as we have seen. I would call it a failure of governance throughout the region. The modern Middle East is about 100 years old. In that time, that chronic failure of governance has led to crisis after crisis, and I would argue has brought the region to the point it's at today, which is deeply dangerous, not only for the region, but for the world, including ourselves. So, you know, there is a fundamental choice here. Either we continue as we have been doing, in which case I think you are going to see Islamic State 2.0, as Islamic State was Al-Qaeda in Iraq 2.0. That is not in our interests any more than watching Afghanistan spiral down in the 90s. Again, the rise of the Taliban and the road to 9/11. Congressman, I have heard much in my career about a failure of intelligence leading to this or that. There's some truth in it, but it's not the whole truth. I call it a failure of imagination, that we cannot imagine how bad things can really get. We couldn't imagine that Iranian and Syrian-backed elements in Lebanon would blow up first the American embassy. I was a survivor of that attack, and later the Marine barracks. We can't imagine how Iran could move into Iraq through the creation of these proxies, and Dr. Lynch is absolutely right, there is a spectrum here, but the weight on that spectrum is toward the Iranian-influenced units.
Mr. Ambassador, is there anyone in the United States government who imagined how bad Syria would be today?
In a word, Congressman, no. And that's what I mean about a failure of imagination. Analysts need to think outside the box. They need to think as though there were no box. I could not have imagined when I left Iraq in the early spring of 2009 that it would descend to the point it's at now. And it is a sharp reminder that you don't end wars by withdrawing your forces. You simply cede the battle space to others more determined.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Dr. Pollock.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I am privileged to get to go around this country and give talks on the Middle East, and I get asked this question frequently. And I'll give you the answer more or less that I give them. The first answer that I give is the relationship to our economy. And I've got to use a four-letter word. It's actually a three-letter word, but it comes out as a four-letter word, and that's oil. We're all infatuated with shale. The truth of the matter is, though, that the world still runs on oil, and the Middle East is a major producer of oil, and Iraq currently is the fourth largest oil producer in the world. Now, could North American shale make up for the complete loss of Iraqi oil? Maybe. I don't think that anybody really wants to find out. And what we've seen in the past is that oil crises have been major problems for the U.S. economy, causing some of the worst post-war recessions that we've experienced. Until we can do better with weaning ourselves off of oil and finding new sources of it, the Middle East is going to matter and Iraq is going to be critical. Beyond that is the point that Ambassador Crocker was making. When I go around the country, I typically have a line that I've been using for over a decade about how the United States is not like an American city in the Southwest. But given the tragic events that have unfolded there in the last couple of days, I'm going to refrain from making that a comparison and simply say that the problem that we have found with civil wars is that they spread. They don't stay contained. Right? There's a very extensive body of scholarly work that demonstrates what scholars call the contagion effect, that civil wars in one country destabilize and then cause civil wars in neighboring states. As you pointed out, Syria helped push Iraq back into civil war, and together they have created a mini civil war in Turkey. In its day, civil war between Israelis and Palestinians caused civil war in Jordan, which then caused civil war in Lebanon, which then caused civil war in Syria. And as you also alluded to, Ambassador Crocker's point about a failure of imagination, I got a pretty good imagination. And back in 2012, having studied deeply on the literature of civil wars, I was thinking about what the Syrian civil war could mean for the Middle East and for the world. And I remember as I was writing a piece asking myself, should I point out that if this got really bad, it could start to affect Europe? And I decided I shouldn't, because people would think my imagination was running away with itself. Well, it not only affected Europe, it helped cause the British to pull out of the EU. Okay? Even I couldn't imagine that, right? But that is the problem with these kinds of civil wars. They don't stay contained. They spill over. If we simply walk away from Iraq and allow it to descend back into civil war, we don't know what comes next. Kuwait, Jordan, maybe Iran, maybe we'd think that was good, at least in the short run. Saudi Arabia. These are countries which at some point we can't possibly accept. They will gut our economy.
Thank you, Dr. Pollack. Dr. Lynch.
Thank you. So for the record, I don't agree that we should have 10,000 troops in Iraq or 25,000 troops. I don't think that we have to go to zero, and I think there's a good argument made for the kind of a residual force of trainers and embedded, kind of small units. But I don't think that we should be thinking about it in terms of putting a long-term 10,000, 25,000 permanent U.S. military garrison in Iraq. I think that would actually put us back in an unhealthy place where we were before the withdrawal. I think what we have now is a situation where we're there at the request of the Iraqi government. There's actually political support at a fairly wide level for the American presence there, and we have a bipartisan support for what we have in Iraq now. So the politics are in some ways right for a small residual force for the United States, in both the United States and in Iraq. But moving to have this kind of long-term, large-scale U.S. military presence, I think, risks unsettling both of those consensuses. It would become a flashpoint for political controversy here in the United States, and would draw a great deal of unwanted attention inside of Iraq to this renewed notion of a permanent American military presence. I think that's actually not a good idea, but we can continue to discuss that. On the question of why it's worth it, I want to also perhaps be a little contrary here as well, to break the comedy that we've had to this point. I think that this is ultimately up to the Iraqis to choose. This is not an American decision. If the Iraqis choose to create a sectarian and exclusionary state, to not confront corruption, to allow the rural and Sunni areas to go without governance, and to not try and meet the needs of their Sunni population, then nothing we do can help them. We could have 10,000 troops, we could have 50,000 troops, we could do almost anything, and it won't help. The choice is up to them. And the hope that we have is that after having faced the crisis of 2014, they are now willing and able to make those choices to create the kind of functional state which can partner with the United States on equal terms. And I think that's the direction we need to be moving in, is having a partnership which is based upon not just keeping a presence in Iraq no matter what, but to have it based on the notion that this is the type of state that we want to support, and giving the types of assistance that can actually support that kind of state. Different way of thinking about it, but I think an important difference.
Dr. Lynch, I think I understand your position. Do you agree that we have a national security interest in the Middle East and in Iraq?
Oh, absolutely. I agree 100%.
So do you think ultimately we should let the Iraqis decide on whether we pursue that national security interest?
No, my point is that if the Iraqis make the wrong choices in terms of the type of state they build, then we can waste an enormous amount of American blood and treasure accomplishing very little. Because ultimately, if they recreate the sectarianism, corruption, and state failure, which led to 2014, then we cannot achieve our national security goals as I think we all agree that they should be defined.
Do you think we can have any influence on that decision?
We can have influence on it, and that I think is what I was trying to say about the political underpinnings that now exist for a sustained partnership between this Iraqi government and the United States. And otherwise, I wouldn't be recommending that we have this kind of long-term commitment and focusing on building the economic, political, and military degrees of cooperation. I absolutely think that this is a moment where we do have that kind of influence, and we certainly have the interest to sustain it. But I want to warn against unconditional commitment, even if you don't have the foundations that would make it possible. That's what I'm most worried about, is that by giving a blank check, we could enable exactly the kinds of dysfunction that created 2014 in the first place.
Thank you. And if I may just conclude with one very brief question, if you could answer in one sentence or less. Just each of you, you have agreed so much on the need for the primacy of a political commitment and how that must lead our efforts in all that we do. I was a frequent critic of the Obama administration because I didn't feel that they understood this. And they responded to the ISIS crisis by just sending military trainers in, which didn't really do much to fix Iraqi politics. We got lucky with a new prime minister, but I don't think that we can claim much credit for the political improvement that's happened there. Do you think this administration understands this and is prepared to make a political commitment the prime commitment? Ambassador Crocker.
Yes, I do think that is the case. When you look at leaders like Secretary Mattis, he certainly knows Iraq up close and personal. The National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, the same, both Iraq and Afghanistan.
Dr. Pollack, do you agree?
I'll perhaps refine Brian's answer slightly and say, I think that there are those in this administration who absolutely understand it and are absolutely committed, but they don't seem to yet have a decision made about what their policy is going to be.
Dr. Lynch.
I have no idea.
Thank you. Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. Representative Scott, Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. As we talk about securing the peace, it seems to me that the more pressure we put on these groups in one area, they simply move to other areas of ungoverned territory. And there's certainly a tremendous number of areas where they can go in Northeast Africa, the Middle East, where they can, it seems, remobilize, re-equip, and come back with maybe a different goal and a different strategy. So my question revolves around that challenge. What would you suggest the best path is to stop what I would call the remobilization or the relocation of the terrorist organizations, where they're able to regroup and come back and attack in another country?
It is an important question, Congressman. In one sense, if we can keep them moving around, that keeps them off balance. But we would have to, again, have the resolve, if they are relocating somewhere else where there is no effective state, to pursue them there. Not by sending in the 101st, but there are other platforms. You know, the more we can keep them on the defensive, the less likely they are to have the time and the space to plan another major attack into Europe or, God forbid, into this country. So, again, I would like to say that we could find a way to eliminate this scourge. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but we sure as heck can keep them off balance. We can attrit them so that they have no safe place, ultimately, in which they can plan strategic level attacks.
Thank you, Representative Scott. That's a great question, and I think it gets to the heart of having to place Iraq within a full-scale regional and international strategy. And so what my comments about trying to build the capacity of the Iraqi state should be read as part of a much wider strategy of trying to rebuild states across the region, and that includes not just rebuilding militaries and counterterrorism units, but actually building governance and actually building accountable states which are responsive to their people, that can provide and deliver services. And so I think that I would absolutely think that you're putting your finger right on the problem with the shattered Middle East, not just a shattered Iraq. That said, I think Iraq is actually a distinctively important place for both al-Qaeda and for ISIS. This is where al-Qaeda transformed for the first time into a serious insurgency back with Zarqawi. This is where the remnants of that insurgency became the Islamic State and were able to move into Syria and take over these parts of Iraq. I think that a defeat and removal, or at least a strategic defeat of the Islamic State in Iraq will have much greater impact on its appeal and attractiveness and power across the rest of the world than pretty much any other place.
Congressman Scott, I will simply add, first, I agree very much with the points that Dr. Lynch made. I think he's got it spot on. I will start by saying that we need to separate out two different problems. They're the problems of the civil wars in Iraq and Syria, for that matter, and the problem of transnational terrorism. They are ultimately related but distinct topics. And I will start by saying, to use a line from a friend of mine within the Trump administration, it is not the case that Iraq and Syria are in civil war because ISIS is there. ISIS is there because Iraq and Syria are in civil war.
That's right.
And so point number one is we do need to stabilize these different countries. At the end of the day, though, you are absolutely right, Congressman. There will always be ungoverned spaces on the map, and the terrorist groups will always seek refuge there. The hope has to be that if we can deny them recruits, because there aren't large numbers of people in places like the Middle East who are desperately unhappy and looking to kill someone as a result of that, you can cut off the flow of oxygen, you can diminish their strength, and then both defensive measures, like those that we put in place after 9/11, and offensive measures, such as special forces operations, drone strikes, et cetera, can diminish the threat to the point where it isn't significant at all.
Madam Chair, I'm almost out of time. One of the other things I think that we need to talk through is whether or not, when we have small pockets where we have 10 or 15 or 20 that we believe to be or know to be, through intelligence, part of one of the terrorist organizations, that we should go ahead and take them out prior to them recruiting and becoming a significantly larger and more capable group. It seems to me that we would do better to, if we know they are what they are, we're not going to fix that, so we might as well help the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Halloran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Pollack, you stated about the stay behind in an indeterminate amount of time. This is the second time today we've heard the issue of our troops staying behind. Afghanistan was the other issue earlier today. And I don't know what's going to happen in Western Syria especially, but if we have potential there. And then we have the Kurdish Iraqi situation, and are we going to be peacekeepers along that, or how are we going to get the UN involved? So what does stay behind mean, and what is the implications of that on the geopolitical issues within that area?
Thanks very much, Congressman. And I think this is an important set of questions for this committee in particular to dig into. As I noted earlier, Iraq is a quintessential civil war. We know a lot about these civil wars. We know a lot about how to bring them to peaceful ends and prevent them from recurring. What the history of these civil wars have demonstrated over and over and over again is that you need to have three conditions in place. One, what's called a herding stalemate, where none of the groups believes that they can win a military victory, and in fact, they have real incentives to stop fighting. Second, there needs to be a political power-sharing arrangement, and third, there needs to be some institution that remains in place for a period of time, typically 10 to 20 years, that guarantees or at least reassures people that conditions 1 and 2 will continue to obtain. Historically, the best institution for that is an external peacekeeping force. And I would argue that that is, at least in Iraq, I am not an Afghan expert, I'm not going to speak to Afghanistan. That's a different mission, it's a war in a very different state of affairs. But in Iraq, that is how we should be thinking about the U.S. force there, as a peacekeeping force. What we've seen is peacekeeping forces need to start with a certain size to establish presence. And my point about the numbers is driven by by CENTCOM and DoD planning for the stay-behind force in 2009, 2010, 2011. The actual military force in Iraq, led by General Lloyd Austin, formulated a plan. They believed that the right number was somewhere between 22 and 25,000 troops to maintain that presence. The Department of Defense refined that and said, we think we can do it with 10,000 troops. I think that those numbers are more or less correct, given where Iraq is today. Now, over time, I suspect that those numbers can come down, because what you see in these civil wars is that over time, the communities rebuild their trust, and that presence can become increasingly symbolic. So this is not Korea. We're not going to need a large force there ready to fight a major war at a moment's notice. But what we do need to be thinking about is the political role of these troops in reassuring Iraqis that they're not going to have violence used against them, that their military is not going to be repoliticized, and their military isn't going to lose the capability to put down bad actors when it's necessary to do so. And as I said, I think that the numbers formulated first by USFI, General Austin and his men, and then refined by the Department of Defense are exactly where we ought to be thinking. Those were the right numbers at exactly this same moment in time.
Thank you, Doctor. Ambassador Crocker, Mr. Scott brought up the issue concerning other locations in the world about terrorism. And we have a significant amount of, a lot of this is going to be requiring State Department work. The military can't do everything, and we'd rather have no war than a war. So do you feel that the current proposed cuts to the State Department, given North Korea and all the other issues going on around this world, are a position that we should be taking?
Thank you for asking that, Congressman. In a word, no. What we are seeing, frankly, is not simply a budget cut in megatons. We were seeing, I think, an effort to deconstruct the State Department and the Foreign Service. And I can tell you, if that is not reversed, this is something we're going to be paying for a very long time. If we have to cut back our intake, then you're going to have that gap moving forward for the next 20 years, where you don't have the senior officer cadre who are fluent in foreign languages, who know these countries and cultures, who know how to deal with it. So I can't put it strongly enough. This is a very, very serious issue. If we don't want to have to fight a whole lot more wars, then you need a strong, well-resourced foreign service to go out there and do what may be possible to see that the troops don't have to come in.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield.
Thank you. Representative Cheney.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thanks very much to all of the witnesses here today. Ambassador Crocker and I had the privilege of serving together in the State Department, and Ambassador, you know that I think you're one of the wisest, most thoughtful members of Foreign Service we have, and I'm very grateful for your appearance here today and for your testimony. Could you talk a little bit about the connection and the relationship between our ability as a nation to influence political events in a place like Iraq and our troops? And in particular, I'm thinking about, you know, as we surged in 2007, what that meant in terms of our leverage in the country, and how you try to replicate that same kind of political leverage in an environment in which we are not going to have that number of troops on the ground, certainly. But how do you make sure that the United States, in addition to the reversing the kinds of cuts that you've talked about, but having the political leverage, is it possible to have the kind of political leverage with all the sides that would be necessary for a political solution in the absence of the kind of military presence that we saw at the moment when our leverage was highest.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and I must say it's very nice to see you sitting there. We will not have that level of leverage again, but I think we may not need that level. The Iraqi forces, after their horrific collapse in 2014, have pulled themselves back together. It is true that the Counterterrorism Service is carrying out a major part of this, but you know, there has been progress over these last 2 or 3 years with the Iraqi army generally. So we want to be in a position to continue to encourage that. We are the United States of America. We do have leverage, should we choose to use it. But that is why, again, I would not make any suggestions on troop levels at this point. We need to see a president engage. I mean, we are a presidential system. If the president isn't decided on what he wants to do, then you start to lose that kind of influence. So again, I would like to see the president ask his Secretary of State to go out to Iraq, spend more than 12 hours there, start a process of engagement with not just the current government, but political leaders across the board, and then report back on what is possible and what isn't possible, and to go from there.
Thank you. And Dr. Pollack, I walked in as you were saying that there will always be ungoverned areas, and in keeping with the great tradition up here in the House of Representatives, I'm not going to let the fact that I walked in 2/3 of the way through stop me from asking you a question. Talk about the extent to which you're not saying that we shouldn't be denying safe haven, are you?
No.
And so when you what's that balance in terms of we've got to deny safe haven, we've also got to deny recruits, but how can you ensure that we're going to deny safe haven in the absence of you know, some basic level of troops, American troops on the ground?
Thank you very much, Congressman. It obviously depends on where we're talking about. In places like Iraq, where I think the United States has a clear national interest that goes beyond the mere terrorism problem, I think the presence of troops is warranted, at least for a certain period of time, and probably longer than Dr. Lynch believes is necessary. There are going to be places, though, like Mali, where I don't think that would necessarily warrant an American military presence because our interests are much narrower. No offense to any Malians who are here or may be thinking about this, but it simply does not rise to the same level as Iraq. Under those circumstances, I think the United States does need to use other tools available to it, whether it be diplomacy or assistance to the host nation, to try to make these places as unhospitable as possible. I want to agree with Dr. Lynch that the best way to do it is to help these countries repair themselves, an effort that you were trying to lead, at least for the Middle East, when you were at the State Department. You know better than I do that if you have functioning societies—
Please don't cost me votes in here today.
If you have functioning societies, you're going to have far fewer terrorists.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I yield back, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. Representative Panetta.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your time, your preparation, and your testimony today. I apologize for being late. In regards to that sort of infrastructure development, I guess I saw something, or the RAND Corporation did something about Mosul's infrastructure when it's water, it's sanitation, its power capacity is not doing that well. What are the current efforts right now, be it through the United States government or be it through the Iraqi government, anything at all to help develop that? Because clearly that will play a part in its self-governing.
There have been pretty massive efforts to deal with the humanitarian crisis dimension of it. There's over 150 NGOs on the ground working, coordinated by the coalition. I think there's been a really quite remarkable effort at the humanitarian relief side, but the reconstruction side is still a blank slate. And I think that you know, in the midst of crisis, it's very difficult to plan for the long term and to begin reconstruction when the fighting is still going on, which I think is why having this hearing right now is so important, because now's the time to get those plans into place, make sure they're fully resourced and coordinated. One of the other problems is that's going to have to be linked up to the political development inside of Iraq. In other words, there has to be some sense of what governance is going to look like in Mosul, who's going to be responsible for the administration of these reconstruction projects, who will get political credit for them, and how will they be linked into the broader Iraqi political system. To me, this is the absolute most important thing for us to be looking at right now.
Okay. Well, thank you, Congressman. It's an important question, obviously. One of the problems the Iraqis confront, and their friends with them, is a diminution of resources. There just isn't that kind of money floating around anymore. They're running a horrific deficit, and you see the consequences. During my time there, in 2007, a decade ago, the Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, extended the first supplemental budget increase. We taught them a lot of bad habits, and supplemental budgets, of course, would be among them. The Prime Minister allocated $250 million to the province of Anbar, because he was finally persuaded that if you really want to turn the tide out there against al-Qaeda, support the awakening. And it worked. Well, Prime Minister Abadi doesn't really have $250 million to push up to Mosul. So I think the emphasis is going to have to be on a hard-eyed analysis of what really needs to be done, and done quickly, to provide momentum for political solutions, but at the same time to be pressing on the issue of governance. Because I think we've all said this in one way or the other. Again, if you want to look through the 100-year history of the modern Middle East, there is one single word that I use: governance, the failure thereof. And that goes back to colonialism and imperialism, the French and the British, and it runs right up to today. Now we have Islamism, also a failure to govern. So even if you do have the money for resources, you've got to get the governance thing down and down right, and it is enormously difficult, and it's going to take a lot of time. I just hope we're prepared to make that commitment.
Understood.
Congressman, if I could just add one point, which is this stuff is very hard to do in the moment. Right? We are once again trying to build an airplane in mid-flight, something that we've repeatedly tried to do in Iraq. I would actually argue the time to have dealt with the governance issue in Mosul, in fact, I was arguing it then, was 18 to 24 months ago, when it would have been far easier to deal with. Unfortunately, we didn't, and it's getting harder and harder. We're coming up on elections in Iraq. Inshallah, there will be elections at some point in the spring. The closer we get to those elections, the harder it is going to be for us to deal with many of Iraq's political problems. And as, again, Ambassador Crocker knows better than anyone, after those elections, we could face a long and painful process of government formation. It's why doing this now is so critical, and why it is so wonderful that you are taking up this issue now and hopefully can push the administration to engage with it more fully.
Understood. Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. Thank you. And we have more questions, but I know Dr. Lynch has indicated you had a hard stop at 4:30, so if you need to leave, we'll certainly want to give you the grace to do that. And thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chairman. I think my students will understand if I stay for the last few minutes.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you. Representative Swazi.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to the witnesses again. And I apologize, like the previous few Congress members, for being late here today and for missing so much. And I apologize if I'm repeating some things that you've asked earlier. I'm concerned about two complicating factors for the long term in the area. One is the close relationship between Iran and Iraq, based upon the fact that major Shia religious sites are located within Iraq. And it's normal for tourists from Iran to come into Iraq on a regular basis. And there's a lot of cultural friendships and relationships based upon these religious sites that have been established over centuries. And how complicating is that factor? The second factor has been the genocide of Christians and Yazidis and other minority groups
within Iraq and Syria. And I just want to get you a quick insight from each of you about how complicating a factor that will be, those two factors will be going forward.
On the first, Congressman, I would certainly never recommend that Iraq take steps to bar Iranian pilgrims from the holy sites in Iraq. You're quite right. Those are major pilgrimage destinations, just as we see Muslims from around the world flock to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. My colleagues have said quite rightly, Iran will certainly have influence in Iraq. It's natural, one neighbor to another. But we also need to keep in mind that an agreement on that they are all Shia together is significant, but there are many, many differences. Linguistic, Arabs versus Persians, lots of constraining elements at work too. So in countering Iranian influence in Iraq, I would go nowhere near an effort to block Iranian pilgrims. On the plight of the Christians in Iraq and indeed in Syria, no question about it. We are reaching the point where we may see the critical weight of the Christian communities, particularly in Iraq, get below the level necessary to sustain their presence. And I would think that that would need to be a very important issue for the administration to take up. But it has to be done delicately. We cannot create a public impression that we're there to defend the Christians. That's sadly only likely to increase the pressures on them. So this is all tough. It's all complicated. As Dr. Pollack says, you can't do it in a moment. You've got to make a commitment to a long-term, high-level, sustained political effort in Iraq and elsewhere in the region.
And how do you militate against the influence of the popular mobilization units? I mean, those are all Iranian-backed, right, for the most part?
No, sir. I think as Dr. Lynch and Dr. Pollack have both said, they run a spectrum.
Okay. You don't have to answer that then. Anything you want to add, Mr. Pollack?
I think they're both excellent points, Congressman, and I'll simply make some broader points. First, as you point out, as we've talked about repeatedly this afternoon, there are deep interlinkages between Iran and Iraq, and there's nothing that we're going to do that are going to end those. Likewise, the problems of genocide and intercommunal violence in Iraq are also pervasive. And it's important to remember the words of a very wise man who used to repeatedly say that Iraq is very, 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 very hard, and it is very, 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 very hard all the time. Did I get all the verys? That said, we also, one of the most remarkable things about Iraq is the ability of this country to overcome all of those problems and all of those interlinkages. We need to remember that in 2007, 2008, when the United States started to reverse the perverse incentives that we created in 2003, 2004, it was incredible how fast Iraq started to turn around. Now, Iraq was never Switzerland, right? Iraq was not exactly, ready for EU membership. But the change, the direction, the delta was remarkable. And it was incredible to see Iraqis coming together out of a recognition that hanging together was much better than hanging apart. So it's simply a way of saying that you're right. There are problems, there are complications. We need to be aware of them. That is exactly why we need to plan ahead, why we need to make a big effort, work with the Iraqis. But we also shouldn't just throw up our hands and say this is impossible.
If I may, the problem of the minorities in Iraq has been an enormous one since 2003. You've seen the devastation of minority communities across Iraq, not just the Yazidis and the Christians, but beyond. The best protection for minorities is to have a strong and capable Iraqi state that can protect all of its citizens. Trying to single out particular communities for protection, I think, is very difficult to do, and it's not sustainable in the long term. But making that part of a broader package of building state capacity, I think, is absolutely vital.
I've exceeded my time. Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman.
You bet. Thank you to each and every one of you. We very much appreciate this. We have more questions we could ask, but we're going to have votes in about a half an hour. We want to get to our second panel. But thank you so much for all your insights and all of your devotion to our country and helping out today. So let's go ahead, and I'd like to invite the second panel to the witness table. Yeah. So we'll invite them in. So as they get settled, I'll make some brief introductions. We want to welcome this Department of Defense panel. We have Mr. Mark Swain, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Stability and Humanitarian Affairs in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. We have Brigadier General James Bierman, Director of the Middle East Division on the Joint Staff, J5. We have Mr. Joseph Pennington, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the Department of State. And we have Ms. Pamela Quanrud, Director of the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS at the Department of State. Due to the time that we have, I think we will forego the opening statements if we could, since we only have a half an hour before votes and we want to get right to your thoughts and your insights on things. So thank you so much for being here. Mr. Pennington, I think I'd like to start with you. What can you tell us about conversations between the United States and the government of Iraq? How long do you anticipate having a large military footprint in Iraq? And what is the prospect of executing an agreeable status of forces agreement with Iraq?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today to testify. I think I will, on the first part of your question, I will kick a large chunk of that to my DoD colleagues, but I will just comment that I think the success that we, and when I say we, I mean the coalition supporting Iraqi partners on the ground have had in the fight against ISIS has convinced Iraqi leaders or Iraqi partners, including Prime Minister Abadi, of the efficacy of partnership with U.S. and coalition forces. I think the Prime Minister is open to and enthusiastic about the prospect of continuing that partnership going forward to meet new challenges in Iraq once the active military operations against ISIS wind down. Again, I want to not get into too much of the DoD territory here, but I think there is a very good prospect for continuing a security partnership under the strategic framework agreement that we have in place with Iraq, and I think there is a good appetite for that on both sides. With regard to the part of the question about status of forces, as you may know, we have an exchange of notes that regulates our military presence in Iraq now. We believe, and I think my colleagues would say the same, that that is sufficient for our presence as it currently stands, given the purpose and the scope of that relationship. Maybe I'll stop there and invite other comments.
Sure. Appreciate your perspective from the Department of State and Department of Defense. Want to weigh in on that?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and Ranking Member Moulton, and all subcommittee members for having us today. For the issue of the SOFA, I agree completely with my state colleague. U.S. forces in Iraq are operating under the 2014 exchange of notes with the government of Iraq. This exchange of notes provides U.S. forces with the appropriate protections and not further commitments and no further commitments are required. So we feel that that exchange of notes is appropriate for right now. Thank you.
Yes, very good. Well, thank you. Mr. Swain, given continued budget pressures, readiness crises across the military, and competing national security interests, how do you expect to achieve our objectives in Iraq?
Thank you very much. As we, the DoD mission in Iraq is focused on dealing with ISIS and to deliver them a lasting defeat. I think that's a critical issue for the United States Department of Defense. It's clear that our objective is to defeat ISIS wherever it exists, and in Iraq is a very critical portion of where ISIS remains. Once they are defeated, we think that that defeat will not occur immediately after ISIS loses its territorial control. ISIS is likely to continue to plot or inspire external attacks, and to deal with that threat, the United States Department of Defense is going to have a relationship with the government of Iraq and the Iraqi security forces to require continued training and to effectively secure liberated areas. Now, the last 3 years of fighting have effectively secured liberated areas, and we have focused on conventional operations, and a new ISIS threat will require proficiency in wide areas of security operations and counterinsurgency, and that's an area I think that we can work with the Iraqi government and the Iraqi military to determine what the needs are going forward with the Iraqi security forces, and that includes the United States and also our coalition partners as we look for the advise and assist teams and to work for the future training missions.
But the question was dealing with our budget situation that we have and the readiness crises that we have encountered. So do you have what you need in order to be able to finish the mission there and carry it out? What are areas of concerns that you have or needs that you may have?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. With the actual budget numbers and the actual numbers of our troops going forward, that is something that in this unclassified open hearing, we are not prepared to discuss the particulars. It's ongoing right now for the planning within the Department of Defense, and to look at what the requirements are with our Iraqi partners, and then come back and work with the committee to determine once we have that plan in a classified closed session, and I think then we'll be ready for an open discussion after that. But at this time, the details on the budget or the numbers are certainly things that we're concerned about, thinking about. It is very clear to us that in the defeat of ISIS, the long-term defeat of ISIS and a lasting defeat of ISIS, we need to have a strong Iraqi government and a strong Iraqi security forces, and that is certainly at the top of our priority list within the department. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Ranking Member Moulton.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us here today. As an Iraq War veteran myself, and I know that I am joined by several others both in the room and General, thank you for your service on the panel. We were in Hilla about the same time in 2003. I can't tell you how painful it is as an Iraq War veteran now sitting on this committee to see us fighting and refighting so many of the same battles that we fought, that our friends gave their lives for. And so the question that we must ask is, how will this time be different? How do we know that now that ISIS is about defeated, there won't be an ISIS 2.0, just as ISIS in many ways is al-Qaeda in Iraq 2.0. We heard from the expert panel that preceded you how important it is that Iraqi politics be the primary effort. The primacy of the political effort is the phrase that several of the panelists used. But I'm not hearing that from you yet. I'm hearing about how we're going to ensure we clean up the rest of ISIS and we train the Iraqi military. I haven't heard anything about how we're going to ensure the success of Iraqi politics, which ultimately will prevent us from having to come back and clean up the mess when Iraqi politics fails. Just before this hearing, I discussed this with Secretary Mattis and General Dunford. And the chairman and the secretary agreed that we have to have a political plan. So where is that political plan? how will it be better and different than the political effort in the past to ensure that we don't repeat the same mistakes and find us coming back to Iraq to refight these same battles yet again?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. Maybe I will start on that. And I think just as we have approached the military issue, the military side of the relationship with Iraq in this fight against ISIS in a different, somewhat different way, what we would call by, with, and through, supporting, but having Iraqi partners lead on the ground, building that partnership from the ground up. We believe that the same kind of approach on the political side is the right strategy going forward. And so we have focused our efforts, our immediate efforts, on strengthening Iraq's ability to govern liberated spaces. And by that I'm referring to our efforts towards stabilization.
Can you just give us an idea of what those efforts are?
Sure. So by stabilization, it's a fairly broad concept, but the way I would define it is to create the conditions on the ground to enable those who have been displaced by the fighting and by the ISIS terrorism to make the decision to return to their homes and live in security, reestablishing their communities with the support of the Iraqi government. Behind that Iraqi government support is the United States and our coalition partners. And so we, on the one hand, have spent more than $1.7 billion to deal with the immediate emergency of humanitarian displacement, making sure people can survive when they are displaced. And beyond that, and more recently, have worked with our coalition partners through the UN Development Program, something called the Funding Facility for Stabilization, to help the Iraqis to go into liberated areas, to rebuild the infrastructure, basic services, water, electricity, schools, health clinics, clearing rubble from the streets, getting some cash into the economy.
So with all due respect, if we had been here in 2004 or 2005 or 2007 or 2008, it would have been the same thing. How is this time different?
I would suggest, Congressman, that it's a matter of reestablishing government authority in areas where they have been absent through our consistent support to help strengthen governing institutions, to partner with Iraqis, and we have an excellent partner.
Sir, I was there last in 2008. We did exactly the same things. How is this time different? How will we ensure that when we do all those same things, as we did, as the previous panelists mentioned, actually quite successfully in 2007, 2008, with over 100,000 troops to assist in the effort, how is this time going to be more successful so it doesn't fall apart again?
On the political side, Congressman, as you know, we're approaching an election season in Iraq. That is something that is going to be, the politics of this are going to be fought out by Iraqis. We have, of course, contacts across a broad range of Iraqis, Sunni, Shia, Kurd minorities. We are encouraging full participation of all segments. We believe we have and there's some polling data to bear this out, that Iraqis are increasingly seeing their governing challenges as requiring national solutions, and so there is a greater sense of an Iraqi national identity, a greater cross-fertilization across sectarian lines. We would expect in this election to see alliances and coalitions built across sectarian lines, which would build a more inclusive governing structure.
So I appreciate the hopeful description of Iraqi politics. You still haven't said a single thing that we are doing differently. What is the United States doing differently? General, would you care to comment on this, please?
I'll make a couple comments, and thanks for the question. Based off of the events in 2014, the Iraqi government invited us in, and what occurred with the rapid spread of ISIS was a representation to Iraqis across the spectrum of how bad things could be. We've established a trust relationship, military to military, but we'd be the first ones to tell you that the ultimate success and future of Iraq is political, is economic, and is diplomatic. Some of the things that I would tell you that I see as different, like you, having made several trips back and forth, I think we have a fragile but responsible Iraqi government, and I think they want a long-term relationship with us, and they have voiced across the military and civilian governance that they want us to stay, because the events of the last 2 years have showed them that they need us. The other thing I would say is the Iraqis, contrary to some of the experiences you and I have had in the past, not to take anything away from the great efforts of the U.S. military to enable the Iraqi operations, they are fighting their own battles. Over the last year, the Iraqis have suffered tens of thousands of casualties in the fights to liberate their countries, and I take nothing away from those extraordinary U.S. and coalition servicemen who've been killed or wounded. God rest their souls. But the Iraqis are carrying this fight on their backs. We're going to have significant challenges as we near the end, as we approach the end of physical ISIS. That's been a unifying factor that has united a lot of disparate elements across the spectrum in Iraq, and we're going to have to work very, very hard, politically, diplomatically, to knit this fragile Iraqi ecosystem together. One of the key components of strong governments is going to be efficient and professional Iraqi security forces. So while we stay, focused within our military lane, we very much see that as a means to an end, that one of the key factors in enabling the Iraqi government is what we're doing on the military side. Thank you.
General, I agree with everything you said. And that was my experience on the ground in Iraq, too, is I understood how important it was for the politics to follow through. But back in 2008, I felt like we had a lot of political resources in country. As I've been to visit Iraq more recently as a member of this committee, I've repeatedly heard from our State Department and officials on the ground that, and our military, that they don't have the political resources necessary. Chairman Dunford, just a couple hours ago, said, talking about Afghanistan, that we need to push State Department resources farther down into the Afghan political system, but we're not doing that yet. Again, has anything changed? Are we doing it now in Iraq where we weren't doing it 6 months or a year ago, so that ultimately where we have not been able to ensure the political success of Iraq in the past, you can now tell me that you have the confidence that we will?
I would just simply agree with what you just heard from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that we would certainly advocate an increased and stronger role.
Thank you, General, for your candor.
From the Department of State, and I think that the folks that they have on the ground are doing remarkable things. But we would support increased efforts in that area.
Would anyone else on the panel care to comment?
If I might, Congressman,
sure.
Just following up on the General's comments, I think in terms of what's different now, I think one thing that is different is that the Iraqis have seen the terrible cost of political failure up close, and the destruction of communities, the genocide that has been carried out against various groups by ISIS, and ultimately the destruction of largely Sunni cities, I think has been a very sobering experience for Iraqis across the political spectrum and across sectarian divides. And I think that is what is driving what I referred to as a more hopeful political picture. There are no political guarantees, and this will be a process that is Iraqi-driven, and we will support in every way that we can. But I think that level of destruction and the level of terror that the population has endured has changed attitudes in Iraq.
Thank you. Director Conrad, do you have anything to add? Mr. Swain, if I may just briefly ask, Do you agree with us, with the consensus of the expert panel that the primary effort must be political in Iraq at this stage?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's no doubt about for sustainable security, for sustainable stability in Iraq over the next few months, years, we have to have the clear. So I agree with that wholeheartedly. And to respond a little bit to the question before, DOD, it's our whole of government approach working by, with, and through. We certainly have to work very closely. We, the Department of Defense, must work very closely with the Department of State and USAID as they work to support the Iraqi government. And we must stay committed. We must be working with our international partners. The UN is doing quite a bit in Iraq right now on not only the humanitarian assistance issues, but also stabilization. They're doing that under and with the Iraqi government. I think that's important that we support the Iraqi government for their viability, and I think if there's anything a little bit different, we are all focused on supporting that government, that Iraqi security force, and working holistically from our government. And to answer your question, we absolutely need to work more closely and support our state colleagues on what the needs are, what the whole needs are for that long term.
Thank you, Mr. Swain. I mean, I'm pleased to hear that, because earlier you had said that the DoD effort is to defeat ISIS, and that was it.
No,
we need a whole government approach.
No, sir, and I apologize if when I didn't have my opening remarks, I didn't get to
Fair enough.
say those points, so I had to go back and review those and get that. But there's no doubt about it's a whole of government approach.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Banks, Indiana.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Pennington, can you talk a little bit about the security cooperation budget for Iraq in a post-ISIS environment? And what does that budget look like today? What are the strategies for what that budget might look like tomorrow moving forward?
Congressman, I know there have been discussions between others from the administration, from the department, about budget issues, and I'm not really prepared to talk about specifics of the budget. We have a robust security cooperation program with Iraq through foreign military financing that I know the subcommittee is aware of. We are continuing that. There's also a train and equip element to this that is DoD run that my colleagues may wish to comment on. But in terms of what budgets look like going forward, I think we need to leave that to other briefers.
So is it safe to assume, though, that the FMF budget might look different in a post-ISIS environment than what it does today?
Congressman, I'm just not in a position to say what it's going to look like.
Okay, that's disappointing. Thank you. I yield back.
Representative Gallego.
Mr. Swain, why isn't the OSD Policies Middle East Office or the Office of the ASD for International Security Affairs presenting here today?
Thank you, sir. My office was asked to come represent, because my area of specialty is stabilization and humanitarian assistance, and it was determined that the aim of this particular committee, subcommittee discussion, would be to focus in that post-ISIS, what we can look to do, the Department of Defense supporting other interagencies in that area. That's the reason, sir.
Okay. Interesting. Is there a disagreement in policy, or worse, is there a lack of engagement, in your opinion, by the regional office leadership at the Pentagon on ISIL's life cycle, especially post-Mosul? We just actually had another briefing before this discussing this also.
No, sir. I see no lack of. We're certainly coherent in policy. I think they feel comfortable that they can send somebody besides the DASD from Middle East up here to brief on our activities. When we talked about the last question by Congressman Banks was to talk about what's the budget for the Department of Defense. 2017, we have $1.1 billion for the training and equipping through NDA Section 1236 authority, and in 2018, we are planned $1.27 billion. So as certainly as the number of dollars and our commitment to working with the Iraqi security force is not lessening, it's increasing. We certainly see the need. Again, as we talked about, we have a plan to defeat ISIS, but the seeds of the next resurgence of ISIS are in the rubble of where the ISIS-controlled areas right now, the areas that ISIS destroyed. And we need to be diligent and work closely with the Iraqi security forces, working with our interagency partners as we sustain that stability so that ISIS 2.0 doesn't grow out of those seeds that are in the rubble. So we're certainly committed to it, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Swain. Who is the acting or current, or who is the current DASD for the Middle East?
Yes, sir. The current DASD is an acting DASD, Brigadier General rank. I believe that's also another reason we have two. We would have two military uniformed officers up here, and I believe the leadership felt that it would be more appropriate if a civilian represented OSD policy. Brigadier General rank is certainly in tune with all of these activities. I talk to him every day about Iraq, Syria, and the de-ISIS efforts. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Just in closing, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, I think for me, it shows a certain level of disagreement and also lack of commitment when we have so many acting positions that are being filled in a policy area that we all think is extremely important. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Representative Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. General, you talked about, if you will, a unifying enemy that has brought people together. Assuming that we're able to defeat that enemy in the near future, one of the issues that will have to be addressed is the issue of the Kurds. They've recently had an overwhelming referendum on independence, and my question revolves around that. How do you see stability in the region for the Kurds after the defeat of ISIS?
You would agree with me, sir, it's a very concerning development. It's one we tried to forestall across the whole of government. Secondary to the political and diplomatic interactions we had with the KRG leadership, we certainly messaged that at the military level as well. It has occurred now. The referendum has come and gone, and we're watching that very, very closely. One of the key factors in the battlefield successes that we've had against ISIL in Iraq has been Kurdish and Iraqi security forces cooperating and working together. Most recently demonstrated in the liberation of Mosul. And we can't afford to have this referendum and whatever follows destabilize us as we're on the brink of defeating physical ISIS. We are watching events very, very closely on the ground. There's been some political maneuvering that's occurring. So far, we have not seen any elevation of violence, but secondary to what's going on the diplomatic side, we certainly in the military are messaging both Iraqi and Kurdish military leaders that we've established very strong relationships with over the last couple of years. It's a concern.
What are Iran's intentions in Iraq and Syria? I mean, do they intend to just try to continue to foster chaos? What do you think endgame for Iran is?
I think the Iranians want to ensure that they create conditions in Iraq so that they're never threatened like they were during the 1980s, which was a horrific and bloody war, and both countries suffered significantly. I think the Iranians want to establish a land bridge that goes from that goes from Tehran all the way into areas of Syria and Lebanon, where they can threaten and potentially apply pressure to Israel. But I think ultimately I would walk back to the first part of my answer and say the Iranians seek a neighboring Iraq, which cannot threaten the revolution and the Iranian regime.
Madam Chair, I know we're short on time. I'll yield the remainder of my time so that other members can ask questions as well.
Thank you very much, and those were very good questions on Kurds and Iran. Representative O'Halloran.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. General, thank you for your service to our country. You had mentioned a fragile government. What defines that fragile government, and in your mind, what can we do to change that?
Yes, sir. I want to make sure I stay in my lane, but I think Iraq is a country made up of a lot of very different, disparate cultural, religious, demographic elements. During my 5 trips back and forth to Iraq, I've been in Shia land, I've been in the Sunni areas, and I've been in Kurdistan. And I think it's a tremendous challenge to any government to try to knit together people with those kind of different interests and agendas, and then to provide responsible and inclusive governance. I would, sir, go back to what I said before, at the risk maybe of repeating myself a little bit. We are very, very focused on ensuring that our efforts to enable the Iraqi security forces, address any internal or external threat, that buys the time for the Iraqi government to continue to coalesce, improve, and provide that responsible governance to the people of Iraq.
Thank you, General. Luckily, we have Mr. Pennington here. And if you can expand on that question and also identify what the current staffing levels are in Iraq for the State Department. Are there additional needs that you look into have? And what are the funding levels for assistance into the area?
Thank you, Congressman. On this question of governance and fragility of governance, I think it is fair to say that the United States government has been very actively engaged in trying to shore up the Iraqi government on a number of fronts. I mentioned the support for Iraqi priorities of humanitarian assistance and stabilization of liberated areas. That is the Prime Minister's focus. That's what helps him politically and helps the government strengthen institutionally. I would also point out the support that we have provided to the Iraqi government in terms of getting its fiscal house in order on the economic side. The economic pressures that Iraq has been under because of the conflict, the presence of ISIS, the collapse of oil prices, the humanitarian crisis, that created an economic crisis both in Baghdad and Erbil of massive proportions. We and other G7 partners stepped forward to fill the fiscal gap. We through a sovereign loan guarantee, $1 billion sovereign loan guarantee, which the Iraqis then followed up by borrowing in the private market. That would not have been possible without our support. And getting a deal with the IMF, which provided the additional financing necessary to close that gap and keep the government on its feet during this time of tremendous challenge. Again, would not have been possible without U.S. support, and that, the IMF program, has been the key to starting the government on a path of significant economic reform, which they are complying with the conditions of the IMF program. So on all of those fronts, we are being both responsive to the needs, the political needs of the Iraqi leadership, supporting them where it's most important to them, and also strengthening the institutions.
And do you feel that the staffing levels are adequate, and that the funding levels, part of the question I asked?
Congressman, in terms of staffing, there was a decline in staffing following the incursion of ISIS into Iraq for security reasons. A lot of those numbers have now trended back up. The chief of mission is continually making recommendations on staffings to staffing levels to respond to needs that he sees on the ground. Washington has been fully responsive to those requests, and so we work those issues on a daily, weekly basis.
And funding?
Funding in terms of our economic support funding for Iraq has been holding steady. We are well-resourced for this year for the activities that I described. Again, not going to get into a discussion of budget levels going forward, but we think for the moment we have what we need, particularly when you factor in that coalition partners on the civilian side and support actually the ratio is roughly 3 to 1. For every dollar we put up for stabilization humanitarian efforts, our coalition partners come up with about 3 times that. And so put all that together, and I think the support has been quite robust.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield.
Thank you. Representative Panetta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate your testimony, your preparation, obviously. I admit, you know a heck of a lot more about this topic than I do, and so my question is going to be pretty broad and pretty easy. But I think in order to accomplish a lot of the goals that you're talking about, you not only need money, you not only need military help and diplomacy, but you need credibility. And so based on your experience, what is the United States' reputation in Iraq with the government, with the people, and does that affect our ability to accomplish our mission?
Maybe I'll start, Congressman. That's a great question. I'll be happy to start, but I would welcome other comments. I think we have built up, since the incursion of ISIS, the coming to power of the Abadi government in the summer of 2014, and the way that the military and now subsequently the humanitarian and the stabilization support has played out in Iraq, I think there is a recognition that the United States' role has been indispensable in allowing Iraq to make the progress that it has made. And I think it is hard to quantify in terms of public support, but I think what we do see is a broad spectrum of support across sectarian lines in Iraq that understand the benefits of a strong relationship with the United States, an American presence, and this goes Shia, Sunni, Kurd. And so when we talk about a future relationship, whether it's security, economic partnership, commercial relationship, I think it is safe to say that there is broad support in the across the Iraqi political spectrum, and I believe that does translate at the popular level as well. It's harder to measure. Despite
the what happened, after 2003, what happened with the Iraq War?
I think our absence from Iraq, or our pulling back from Iraq of 2011, and that's another topic that we probably won't get into here today, but it did, and then our coming back to Iraq, in a sense, in 2014, when Iraq was faced with the most grave crisis, has really, I think, changed minds in Iraq. Or, of course, there are some who will never accept that presence, but I think most Iraqis want the U.S. to be with them, want our support, welcome our support, and look for a long-term relationship with the United States.
Great.
And I would just, sir, add to that good answer by saying we have gained a level of credibility in the way we've conducted the campaign. You know, looking back at where we were at 2014, when ISIS had overrun much of western and northern Iraq, working by, with, and through the Iraqi security forces. We have steadily, over a period of 2 years, we've stayed focused, we've stayed committed, we have made common cause with the Iraqis, and we're seen in some respects as winners. But I would say, and you know, it's a soft pat on the back, if at all. That's not going to be enough in the long term. And one of the drumbeat themes from all of you is. It needs to be political and it needs to be diplomatic. And I think we could very easily lose some of the credibility we've gained by battlefield military success if we don't translate those gains into stabilization. You know, still a million displaced Sunnis who, you know, they think it's great that that their city's been liberated, but if their homes, their neighborhoods, their infrastructure's wrecked, whatever goodwill we've bought for the Iraqi government, we've got to follow up on that rapidly, and that's going to be a big determinant of our long-term credibility.
Great. My answer to that question, Congressman, is in the past, after 2003, we were I would put it in terms of we were the big brother, and we had a little brother. In the last few years, it's a partnership. They have an established government. They have an established Iraqi security force. We are not the big brother. We are a partner along with other coalition members who are coming in, working with side by side. I think that is also a bit of a difference, that it's not this paternalistic relationship. It is a partnership.
Outstanding. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Schwazi.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you to all of you for your service to our country. We were very grateful to you for your good work. I traveled to Afghanistan in the spring, and there was a very clear military 5-point plan as to what the strategy was going to be from the military perspective. And I'm certain that there's a clear military strategy that's been documented by the Department of Defense related to Iraq and Syria. My question is the Department of State have a good document that I can read as to what the long-term plan is over the next 4 or 5 years related to both Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria? Ms. Conrad? No?
Thank you, sir. Just to clarify, are we talking on the military side?
No, on the Department of State side, on the more the civilian side.
We do have have strategy documents that are not time limited that define our interests and long-term strategies in Iraq. Afghanistan is outside of, I think, any of our purview. Those things we could discuss in a different setting.
Okay, but I'd like to get that document if I can. Give me a good document to read. Okay?
We'll take that back.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Just wondering how many of you have read the testimony from the first panel before? Have you had access to that, or have you had an opportunity? Raise your hand if you have. You have. Good, good. I thought it had a lot of good suggestions, a lot of good insights to be considered in there, so I'm glad to hear that you did that. General, there was some discussion in the last panel about the number of troops that we should have remain to stabilize and once ISIS is defeated. Do you have an opinion on that? What do you think that we need as far as numbers of troops?
Yes, ma'am, and I know you'll understand if I talk probably generally without specific numbers. We want to ensure that there's a balance that we need to strike. Coming back to the discussion of plans, our focus after the defeat of ISIS in terms of reliable partnership, building Iraqi capacity, is going to be on training, equipping, intelligence, counterterrorism, and security assistance. And I would say we want to leave just enough, but we also need to ensure that we remain very aware of the Iraqi political environment, and that we don't wear out our welcome. The Iraqis continue to signal that we want us there. And we're having some very positive talks in terms of what's the right amount. There was a comment made earlier about some of the resource challenges we're seeing with all our commitments across the globe. So we're very focused on what is the smallest amount that we can leave in terms of residual capacity that will have the effect that we need to build Iraqi capacity. I think the conversations, which are not in our lane, but but we're a part of, have been very positive back and forth between U.S. Iraqi governments and some of the participating coalition governments.
Yeah. Mr. Pennington, along those lines, one of the most important things that needs to occur is this political solution. It is the very difficult job of putting together an inclusive government that has Sunni and Shia and Kurds, and is going to, respect all the minorities, Christians, Yazidis, etc. What efforts are being made by the Department of State now to help forge this discussion and this relationship? And with the presence of Iran there, how successful do you think this would be to be able to get this together and get it right?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Again, we are now heading into an Iraqi election season, so these issues are going to be debated during the course of that process. We can't, of course, control how that process comes out, but we can, of course, make sure that we are in connection with those across the spectrum in pushing them toward our central ideas of how governance, how we see governance in Iraq, which is inclusive, which is responsive, which is service-oriented, and which is cognizant of all sects, including minorities and their interests. So we have discussions with all sides, Sunni, Shia, Kurd, minority, across the spectrum about those issues. They know that support from the United States depends on inclusive governance. We've made that very, very clear. We see the Prime Minister as someone who is governing Iraq from, despite all the challenges, from a nationalist, from an Iraqi perspective, not from a sectarian perspective. And so we see that he has developed, we believe, support from populations, including many of the communities who have been liberated, which are mostly Sunni communities. And so if you look at public opinion polling in Iraq, for example, the attitudes toward the central government in Baghdad among Sunni populations have increased significantly in the last 6 to 12 months because of the effort against ISIS and the effort to get people to return to their homes. And so we definitely have influence on the process and on the actors, but in the end, these are Iraqi political decisions. There will be coalitions formed, alliances formed. Our preference, of course, is that those alliances include cross-sectarian groupings. We think that in the current environment that is possible and even likely.
Very good, thank you. Do you have any secondary questions? Yes, Representative Moulton.
Just a concluding comment, and I want to, first of all, thank you all for participating in the panel. Just as I expressed, the responsibility that I feel as a member of this committee, but especially as an Iraq War veteran, to ensure that we don't waste more lives in Iraq, that we finally get this right after many times of getting it wrong and repeating our same mistakes. I hope you will feel that responsibility as well. And I know that it's difficult working under an administration and having the constraints of that environment where not everybody in the administration may see eye to eye with you or may agree with you. But I hope that you will remember the troops on the ground, the State Department folks on the ground, the people who are trying to get this right and need your support to succeed. Thank you.
Congressman, can I just make a point about that?
Yes, sir.
I pledge my allegiance to the Constitution, and I support the President of the United States and all the people appointed over me. But I come to work every day because of all the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that are out there, and also our State Department people. So I take that commitment to heart, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that we're deeply saddened. But on October 1st, just most recently in Iraq, a service member lost his life to an IED. Another service member was a casualty to that. So our heartfelt condolences go up to their families. And that's not lost on me or anybody on the panel, so we appreciate you saying that, and we certainly think about it, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Wayne.
And I just wanted to thank each of you for coming today, and thank you for your commitment to the issue at hand and getting Iraq have an opportunity to have success there for the future, and remembering the troops. I think we've lost over 4,500 American soldiers have given their lives to give the people of Iraq an opportunity to have freedom and to keep us safe here at home. And So thank you for remembering that every day and for keeping that in mind. I'm encouraged by the polling and some of the things we're seeing, the gains that have been made the last few years. But we need to make sure and get this right moving forward. We have a wonderful opportunity ahead of us to chart a new path for Iraq. It's not going to be easy, but I know us here in Congress and on this committee are committed to doing what we can to help support this effort, because we want to see it succeed from here on out. And so we appreciate your commitment to that. Look forward to working with you. And thank you for coming today, for your testimony. And with that, our hearing is adjourned.